The original Metroid for NES and Famicom was, by all accounts, a huge step forward. Its focus on exploration, puzzle solving, and combat was, and still is, addictive. The game had very strong theming as well, with distinct areas all unique from one another with different art styles, coloring, and music to accompany them. Oh, and who could forget the bosses? Kraid, Ridley, and Mother Brain are all staples in the Metroid franchise at this point, for better or worse. Despite its strengths, however, Metroid 1 was a flawed game. It lacked saving on the NES, opting instead for a password system that was cool and janky at the same time. It had a pretty brutal difficulty curve and would punish players quite severely for dying. This was mostly because players would respawn with only 30 health, and many of them believed that grinding energy drops from enemies was the best way to get it to max. It wasn't, but the game did little to tell you otherwise. Oh, and who could forget the lack of an in-game map and the inability to aim downward? If you took the time to figure it out, Metroid 1 could be an amazing experience. Like I said in my last video, however, I would not blame anyone for skipping it. It's certainly a divisive title, but also one that garnered enough praise to warrant a sequel. Metroid 2: Return of Samus was released for the Nintendo Game Boy in 1991 for North America, and 1992 everywhere else in the world. Despite its confinement to a handheld, the game manages to improve upon almost every aspect of the original. The folks over at Nintendo R&D 1 really learned from their previous endeavor and made a superior product from that experience. It's far from perfect, of course, but Metroid 2 isn't a game I think should be skipped. The nature of its design and the improvements made from the original make it infinitely more approachable and worthy of your time. As long as you can get past the tiny puke green screen, that is. Thankfully, we don't have to play this on original hardware, which means having a clear image, with color if you so choose. No matter what though, you'll have to play on a tiny window. 160 by 144 pixels is not a lot to work with. That being said, let's get into the nitty-gritty of this phenomenal sequel. If you haven't seen my previous video, I'd suggest checking it out either before or after this one. The extra context it provides will be very helpful in understanding why Metroid 2 is such an improvement. That'll be linked down below or in the top right corner of the screen. So, where else should this video start than with the story? Like its predecessor, Metroid 2's story is told mostly in the manual included with the game. After the events of the first game, the Galactic Federation is wary of Metroids ending up in evil hands once again. So, they send a research team to the planet where the first Metroid was discovered, a planet named SR-388. Once they touch down on the surface, the team builds a research station, but it goes dark almost immediately afterwards. A team of soldiers is then assembled to investigate the situation, only for that team to also go dark shortly after landing. The Federation then holds a meeting and determines that there must still be Metroids on the planet. Fearing what could happen should they be unleashed upon the galaxy, they hire bounty hunter Samus Aran once again. Her mission this time is to travel to SR-388 and exterminate the Metroids. It's a simple premise, but one that is perfect for the handheld format this game was built for. And hey, the manual gets Samus's pronouns right this time around, so yay! Anyway, the game truly begins with us landing on the surface of SR-388, and our ears are immediately met with a banger of a track. Much like Brinstar in the previous game, this first track is meant to get you hyped up for your journey, and it 100% succeeds in doing that. Seriously, I think this is my favorite song in the entire game, but that's not saying much since the rest of the soundtrack is made up of mostly beeps and gurgles until the very end. Technical restraints aside, I imagine this was done in an attempt to make the game more atmospheric, but it doesn't really succeed in that. What really sells the atmosphere is the environmental design. Admittedly, it's not as vibrant as the first games, but that's due in large part to the monochrome screen of the original Game Boy. However, if you play on a Game Boy Color, you do get some hits of color with Samus and the enemies being red and yellow while the environment is blue and white. This doesn't change anything gameplay-wise, but I would argue that it does make enemies and items easier to spot at the very least. As for the environments themselves, we get a wide variety of shallow cave, deep cave, and deeper cave. Take your pick, they're all perfect for a weekend getaway. I'm kidding, if you want to take a vacation anywhere, you'd want to do it at the Chozo Ruins. I absolutely love these sections as they really stand out from the naturally twisty caves with their straight, blocky designs. They give off a very strong vibe of ancient architecture that I can't help but adore. Plus, they almost always contain items of some kind, which is always welcome. Other than the ruins, there's a few sections near the very end that are reminiscent of Norfair from the first game, and a sort of laboratory/Metroid nest. But that's it. I joked about it earlier, but really, like, 90% of this game is just different variations of caves. You could say the same thing about the last game too, but at least that one had colors. The shallow blue of Brinstar was very different from the purple depths of Norfair or the cold steel of Torian. I am willing to say that I like the texture work of Metroid 2 much more, though. Which is good, considering that different textures were the only way to differentiate areas. It's honestly impressive as hell they were able to fit so much detail on such a tiny screen. Which is a great segue into Samus's new look. It's a massive upgrade from her original sprite, and I love it. It's got so much more detail due to being bigger on the screen, and it really helps Samus be more defined. Her running animation is still a bit goofy, especially with how she swings her arms side to side, but overall, the posing is much better when standing still, crouching, or aiming. Also, due to the monochrome display only showing shades of green, the devs had to give the Varia suit a different silhouette to the power suit, since they couldn't change its color drastically. Thus, Samus's iconic shoulder balls came to be. A pretty cool moment where technical restraints give birth to a defining character trait. Unfortunately, a lot of the enemy variety present in the first game was lost here, and I can't really put my finger on why. On paper, the game has just as many, if not more, enemies than the previous games, so they should be just as memorable. That's just not how it is for me, though. Except for the Metroids, but we'll get to them in a bit. I suspect this is, once again, due to the limited color palette. Although the enemies are red in the GBC version, they still just blend together in my mind. Though the stupid Chozo head turrets and Arachnus stand out a bit. The turrets because I love birds and I think they're cute. And Arachnus because you only fight him once to get the spring ball. But yeah, surprise surprise, the real standout enemies of this game are the Metroids again. It makes sense, considering that killing them is literally your main objective. So, in order to give this task a bit more variety, the devs gave the Metroids multiple forms that change how you have to fight them. To start, we have the Alphas. Being the first ones you encounter in the game, these guys still resemble their classic look a bit, while being an obvious departure. With this new evolution, though, comes an invulnerability to the cold, and a vulnerability to missiles. Which is good, since you don't have the Ice Beam from the start. From there, we get the Gammas. These guys are basically bigger alphas with a laser attack that can destroy your missiles, and which does a lot of damage if it hits you. Again, all you gotta do is spam them with missiles till they drop. Next up are the Zetas, and these guys are the biggest departure in terms of looks. The Alphas and Gammas still resemble their classic look in some ways, but the Zeta has feet, for God's sake. It still floats around like all Metroids do, but now it's got tiny feet and a defined mouth. I can't say I really hate this design, but I really do prefer the traditional one. After the Zetas comes the Omegas, which are the final stage we encounter before the ending, and basically look like larger Zetas with much more health. Seriously, I think these guys take like 60 missiles to kill or something like that. It's nuts. And last, but certainly not least, we've got the classic larval Metroid. Just like on Zebes, these guys are vulnerable to the cold and take 5 missiles to kill once they've been frozen. Much like everything else in this game, they're much bigger than their previous incarnation, and they look way meaner as a result. Though you only fight them at the very end of the game, I still love these little guys so much, especially since they're much easier to get off if they latch onto you. Since these guys make up the majority of the game's progression, I think it'd be good to go into exactly how you fight them. As I said from the jump, every Metroid except the larval ones are vulnerable to missiles, so all it takes is a barrage of explosives to take them out. However, their figure 8 pattern of movement can make hitting them quite difficult. This can be easily remedied if you manage to get underneath one, as this opens them up to be juggled, as I like to say. This tactic doesn't apply to the Zetas and Omegas though. I'm not sure why exactly this is, but I like to think that it's because they have feet and can kick away Samus's missiles before they hit. That being the case, you have to hit them from the front or back to do damage. This is particularly hard for the Zetas, since they're still pretty small and move fast. The Omegas, on the other hand, are pushovers that can be easily juggled by simply standing at their level and stun-locking them with repeated fire. All in all, the Metroids of this game make for solid mini-bosses no matter what form of them you fight, which is how it should be with how important they are to the story, but they are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Metroid 2's gameplay. As I'm sure you've noticed from the footage, you can finally crouch and aim downward when falling now! Great! This is arguably the biggest improvement over the first game, and is made immediately clear by the opening when you have to destroy the blocks at your feet without morph bombs. While I don't hate how the previous game handled this, with you having to get the aforementioned bombs to damage enemies at your feet, I can't deny that this is much better. It just makes more sense and is so much more intuitive. And yet, despite the obvious upgrade, I still found myself wishing I could aim diagonally. Maybe I've been playing too much Zero Mission lately, but I kept running into situations where enemies would be just above where I could hit them while standing, which led to a lot of tiny jumps and spamming beam shots, praying one of them would land. That's only a small complaint though, and more of an annoyance than anything else. I am still beyond happy with the changes made regardless. Another great addition are the energy and missile refill stations dotted around the map. A major complaint of the original game was how often you had to stop and grind for health or ammo. So, Nintendo decided to add in these stations to make the process of filling up easier, and I am so happy about it. Some are pretty obvious and easy to access, while others are a bit more hidden and may require some wall crawling to reach. Either way, just finding one of these was a godsend, even if I didn't need what it was providing at the time. It was just nice to be able to top up without wasting time grinding. My one gripe with these things doesn't actually come from their utility at all. They are an across-the-board good thing for the game. But, for some reason, Nintendo neglected to put either one in the final few areas of the game, specifically the second and third to last areas. Meaning, if you want to fill back up after fighting some Metroids, you'll have to do a lot of backtracking. I get that maybe this was done as a time-wasting tactic, considering the game's endings are tied to completion time, but it just felt awful. I mean, seriously, would it have been so hard to at least put a missile refill somewhere close by? At least then I could go on with less health if I chose to. I physically cannot beat the game without enough missiles. Thankfully, they did put one of each right outside the final area of the game, making it easy to fill up before the final fight. To finish out the new additions, let's talk about the new items. First up is the Spider Ball, an ability which allows Samus to climb on surfaces while in the Morph Ball. This thing is a great help for getting around the much taller, open level design. It also helps a lot out with climbing out of single block holes when you can't quite position yourself right to jump out. My only real gripe with it is that it moves a bit too slow for my liking. Speaking of, another great addition is the Spring Ball, which just lets Samus jump while in the Morph Ball without the use of a bomb. Not the most earth-shattering upgrade, but definitely a solid quality of life one. Something with a bit more substance, though, is the Space Jump. An upgrade that I both love and hate. All it does is let Samus jump repeatedly while somersaulting to gain height or distance. On paper, this is an awesome ability that basically negates the slowness of the Spider Ball. In practice, it's a bit complicated. See, you can't just spam the button and fly. There's a rhythm to it you have to follow, otherwise you'll just go crashing back to the ground, and it is so finicky. Seriously, 1 minute I'd feel like I had it down, and the next I couldn't even get one extra jump. I genuinely have no clue why this is, and most people online don't seem to have an answer. The one workaround I've found is to let yourself fall one block before hitting the button again, But even that only works sometimes. When it does work though, it's awesome. So, make of that what you will. Oh, and when you combine it with the screw attack, Samus basically becomes a deadly Beyblade that can fly, which is so much fun. As for the non-jumping new items, we only have the Spazer and Plasma Beams. The Spazer splits the standard beam into 3, which makes hitting targets much easier by requiring less precision. The Plasma Beam, on the other hand, is the most powerful beam in the game that can one-shot pretty much every enemy, apart from Metroids and a few others. These are both excellent additions, but since the beams don't stack, they feel a bit pointless, especially since you still need the Ice Beam to beat the game. However, you get plenty of time to try out the other options, and there's an Ice Beam spawn right outside where you need it, so that's nice. But that's it for the new additions. It's funny that all of these have returned in almost every game since, except for the Spider Ball. I mean, we've seen it return in the Prime games, but it's restricted to special magnetic rails. A choice that makes sense, since having an item that lets you go practically anywhere would be severely game-breaking. Regardless, it's cool to see the Spring Ball, Space Jump, and Plasma Beam make their debut here. They're all fantastic items that cannot be missed in any Metroid title. Pivoting away from the items though, I'd like to talk about the ending of the game. Specifically the battle with the Queen Metroid. Everything leading up to it is stuff we've seen before in Torian. Metroids float around, contributing nothing to society except a missile shortage, and that's about it. Though, just before you encounter them, a strange spherical object is seen just out of view. It's not like anything you've seen before, so you know it's gotta be something special, but you have no idea what it could be. Anyway, after taking out all the Metroids, there's only one left. The mother of them all, the Queen. Now, this fight isn't the flashiest in the series, but it is leagues better than the Mother Brain fight from the first game. The Queen has a few attacks at her disposal, and you actually have to react to them by either dodging her bite or taking out the projectiles she sends at you. It's a test of skill and endurance, as she takes a whopping 150 missiles to take out. That is, if you don't know the secret quick kill method. It's really easy, but so goddamn cool at the same time. Basically, after she's stunned, you go into Morph Ball mode and jump into the Queen's open mouth. Her neck will retract, and after a moment, she'll swallow you, allowing you to lay bombs in her stomach. This causes massive damage, but won't kill her outright. You gotta repeat the process a few times before the Queen will die, but it is much quicker and easier than the 150 missiles would be. I know I said it once before, but this is so goddamn cool. I love this sort of thing in games, the sort of thing where you might not think to try it, but when you do, and it works, it's just amazing. And it's totally optional. You don't have to do this method if you don't want to, which lets the player decide if they want an extra challenge or not. Truly an exceptional boss to end the game on, and a bang for the Metroids to go out on. At least, that's what you might be thinking as you move past the Queen's body and find yourself face to face with the strange sphere you saw earlier. It's revealed to be an egg as it cracks open and pops out a baby Metroid. This is such a heartwarming moment for me, which is surprising for a game that looks like this, but the fact remains. You cannot kill this Metroid, nor should you want to. It's imprinted upon Samus as its mother. It flies around you eagerly and helps you escape by eating these capsule things. It's just so adorable, and after a game full of violence, it's nice to not kill all of the Metroids. This thing may be the most powerful weapon in the galaxy, but it is baby! With our adopted child in tow, we climb our way back to the surface of SR-388 and have to get over one final hurdle before reaching our ship. I love this little part simply for the fact that you get to see the stars as you take your victory lap while this beautiful track plays. It's the only time in the entire game that there's a background other than plain black, and it punctuates the conclusion of this game perfectly. As is tradition at this point, there are multiple endings to the game. Only 3 this time, but again, the best one shows Samus in her underwear. I made my view on this thing clear in my previous video, but I'll say again that I don't feel strongly on this sort of thing either way. I am glad we've gotten away from it in modern titles though. I'd much rather just see Samus without her helmet or get some cool artwork to look at. But that's Metroid 2: Return of Samus for the Game Boy. All in all, an amazing sequel to a solid NES game. It hits all the right notes that the previous game did, while fixing some of the more pressing problems that game had. I certainly didn't feel like I had to defend this game as much as the last one, at least. I'd still suggest you use a map and save states, despite the game having save stations built into it. But, I will say, I don't think they're as necessary as they were with Metroid 1. This game is much more linear than the first, so getting lost mostly boils down to where the hell are the Metroids, and not so much where the hell do I go? Which is exactly why I wanted to cover both of these games, aside from the fact that they're the first two in their series. They build upon one another and bring us to what many consider the peak of the franchise with Super Metroid. Knowing where the series began, not just in a narrative sense, but a gameplay one, is extremely important to understanding why Super is so monumental. At least, that's how I see it. But that's for another video, and I don't want to undermine the importance of Metroid 2 since it is a crucial entry in the franchise. I mean, we literally kill, almost, all the Metroids in the galaxy. The events of this game have reverberations throughout the series that reach all the way to Dread, 30 years later. It is as integral to the story of Samus as the first game was to the Metroidvania genre. Plus, it's just plain fun to play. I only returned to Metroid 1 for my video on it, and I really don't have much desire to ever go back to it. I actually wanted to replay Metroid 2, whether I was gonna make a video on it or not. And I think that says a lot. This game is worthy of your time, especially if you're a fan of the genre or of the franchise. I really can't recommend it enough, and I hope you'll give it a shot if you haven't already.